demonstrate a mathematical proof of a massive Hebrew Exodus. And by doing that, we will be turning a soft science into a rock-hard science. Now, archaeology is often defined as being one of the soft sciences, defined as being soft by Thoughtco and other sophists. A soft science despite relying on pretty hard artifacts that are not squishy at all. Still a soft science, right up there with psychology, sociology, and anthropology. And of course we all know the oxymoron of poli-sci, a sci that presumably relies on 95% accurate polling. And for that demeaning definition, Thoughtco defers to the almighty Science Council, a council that licenses various bodies and societies as bona fide scientists, that license them as scientists operating in good faith, as if they could never lose their well-earned faith. A council that differentiates hard from soft using the following criteria. 1. Objective observation, measurement and data. 2. Evidence. 3. Experiment and or observation as benchmarks for testing the hypothesis. 4. Induction, reasoning to establish general rules or conclusions. 5. Repetition. 6. Critical analysis. 7. Verification and testing, which is critical exposure to scrutiny, peer review, and assessment. Now, to that end, our present Mount Sinai archaeology presumably fails that criterion in all those inductive ways. 1, by failing to be purely objective, right? As if that type of objectivity were even possible. By failing to provide sufficient evidence, right? Whatever you determine to be evidence. By failing the scientific experiment due to a lack of exhaustive digging, as if there's exhaustive digging in the other field. And presumably due to our presumably clouded above ground observation skills. 4, by faulty logical induction, such as, hey, Moses physically walking on burning rocks, right? Or by the inability of experimental replication, for example, trying to part the Reed Sea. Or the inability to locate those formidable 10 Commandments. 6, by a profound lack of critical analysis. Analysis in a domain where biblical correspondence is not permitted to determine reality. And finally, by a vast unwillingness of peers to review and assess these evidential issues, since the implications are so vast and traumatizing. And that is where AI will be particularly helpful, since AI doesn't have those mortality or tenure concerns whatsoever. AI cannot be traumatized. So AI should theoretically be able to weed subjectivity away in its entirety, while at the same time granting the certain plausibility of miracles, since the Big Bang event is essentially a miracle, as is quantum mechanics. So AI is in one way in which we may improve our critical analysis, one way in which we can improve our objectivity by applying some previously agreed upon mathematical formula, by applying some abstract math in order to satisfy the Science Council's #1 criteria. A mathematical paradigm which I proposed to the highly regarded Gershon Galil recently, in order to turn our present soft epigraphy into hard epigraphy. A paradigm which would take a great deal of work, would take a great deal of collaboration between epigraphers and mathematicians in order to yield a reasonably accurate evaluation. But this would be a frightening evaluation of their translating skills as well. A massive project which would detract from his current work, however, detract from his work of validating his thesis on that 48-character lead tablet, a work which, incidentally, I'm in 100% agreement with. So let's examine how that math might be applied in our Mount Sinai example then, applied to our inscription at the very base of the actual Mount Sinai, a provenience that grants additional verisimilitude. Let's examine how pretty basic algebra might be applied in the soft arena of epigraphy, in the squishy arena of transcriptions and translations, in order to satisfy the very first criteria of the Science Council. Translations from epigraphy which may be in pictogram, logogram, or in alphabetic format. All formats are admissible in this wide open field. This is an essentially infinite field with an essentially infinite vector space with an essentially infinite number of factors. An algorithm where multiple formats get to multiply the veracity. They get to multiply the truth of a common theme, with a veracity factor yet to be determined. But let's just start with a modest veracity factor of 2, shall we? A modest integer of 2 in what may be considered the ring theory of our abstract algebra. A very modest multiplier, since an integer of 1 is merely an identity marker in ring theory. So we have a very modest doubling being proposed, since a factor of 1,000 seems a bit much, don't you think? So here's our sample application. In this particular test case, we will use our petroglyph panel as a polynomial equation. We will construct a simplified polynomial equation in order to determine a reasonably accurate root, to determine a reasonably accurate probability of my translation being correct. We will use our petroglyph panel article despite our nearby birthing billboard epigraphy being just as compelling, mathematically speaking. Articles yet to be contested by my peers, by the way. No comments from them whatsoever, despite being readily available on academia, YouTube, and Facebook, despite being accessible for months. So, starting from our alphabetic base, we have those 4 solid letters described in that article. Letters with an incredible congruence and consistency with our known Hebrew letters, having 100% orthographic congruence with our Gizar calendar, right along with our other artifact distributives. A Hebrew calendar, even if some radicals think that it may be Phoenician instead. Coastal Phoenician, Greek, that the nearby residents for Jerusalem would have destroyed in an instant. Not liking those boat people at all. So let's call that a distributive congruence, or OC, shall we, as in OCD. Then let's multiply that indeterminate variable by the depth of the field. We should call F. Letters that happen to come from a field of 22. That is, if there are 22 letters in that ancient Hebrew alphabet. So let's say we have 100% congruence from a field of 22 then, yielding a perfect 22, a likelihood of one letter being selected in one of 22 chances. So, with 4 letters, we would then have that likelihood to the 4th power, a likelihood in 1 times 22 times 22 times 22 chances, yielding a random probability of 1 in 234,000 chances. Pretty remote randomness, I'd say. Even more remote than rolling snake eyes 3 times in a row. Your casinos would definitely want to check your dice. A reasonably high probability of being an actual word then, rather than just your basic cow, and a really abstract cow at that. Now, if you add yet another letter, then you have an even higher probability of wordship. Then you're up in the millions in wordship, merely from the alphabet alone. Then, if you add supporting evidence for that word, then you have additional proof for that word. Immediate supporting evidence from additional words, logograms, or pictographs on that or on nearby artifacts. And that is how context is properly determined. That is how the overarching theme is determined, with the supporting help of a meme, perhaps. And in our present example, we have just that. We have that immediate supporting evidence tightly intertwined with our basic words. We have that evidence in the form of a reasonably good map. A map which another well-known epigrapher privately suggested to me, but we won't mention his name at the moment. A map indicating the very route taken, with the words of our epigraphy indicating the actual time taken. A route that indicates the starting point, as well as indicating the present point, along with a major geological marker somewhere in between. Yes, the standard marker for water. A marker visible from that present point. But since that route would indicate an obvious miracle, let's just assign it the very modest integer of 2 once again. Without that miracle, it would be much, much higher. Though some who would claim to have a spiritual neutrality would assign that map a value of 0, a neutral integer, and would multiply the above by 0. Clearly, they do not understand ring theory at all. However, we now have a probability rating of about 500,000 now, with that map included, at least. But if we include the less immediate evidence in our polynomial, we would then have a probability well over 1,000,000. Which is to say, if we include the extended cattle train of our panel, we would then have the additional supporting evidence of a journey, of a prolonged journey, with very many people, men, women, and children, not boat people. But let's just assign this supporting evidence a modest integer of 2 as well. And let's just stop right there for the sake of brevity. Let's just be conservative and say 1,000,000 to 1 evidence. 1,000,000 to 1 evidence that this word actually means a 2-month journey. Yes, we have that Hebrew YRHW that virtually all scholars agree to mean exactly 2 months. No two ways about it. Written by a highly literate and highly artistic Hebrew, not abstract in the least. Overwhelming evidence that confirms this theme and confirms those letters and corresponds with the biblical account, if that means anything to you. So we have very hard evidence now, very hard science. You want to argue with that evidence? Argue with my math? Go ahead, show your stripes. Just like those Jacobite cows on our panel. Go ahead. I'm waiting. Cheers.